So we're going to make a quick audible. We're going to start the panel now. And so as they come up, I'll introduce our I'll introduce the panel. I'm laughing because he said he really didn't hit me that hard. They were playing football earlier. This panel will discuss and address doctrinal and training solutions to prepare agile and adaptive aviation leaders to win in a complex operating environment. And our moderator today is Ms. Susan Hawkins, Senior Director, Strategy and Mission Solutions, Navigations, Targeting and Survivability Division, Northrop Grumman Corporation Mission Systems. Let's give her a round of applause as she comes.
Thank you. My father used to say, the more important you become in life, the shorter your title becomes. And it took you about 2 minutes to say mine, so that kind of tells you where I'm at. So thank you very much and good morning. All right. So it is absolutely my honor and pleasure to moderate today's panel, and I would like to introduce our panel, of which two you just heard from this morning. So we have Major General McCurry, Commanding General, Aviation Center of Excellence, and Fort Rucker. Sir, thank you very much for your leadership in today's conference. We greatly appreciate it. Next to him is Major General William Taylor, who just spoke, the Director of Army Aviation, Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff, the G357. Sir, thank you for your comments earlier today. We also have joining us today Brigadier General David Hall, who's going to bring to the panel today the National Guard perspective. So thank you very much for being here. And of course, we have here Major General retired Kenneth Quinlan, who I've learned today not only has really just helped many people here in this room as they grew up in the Army, but can also take a tackle. So with that, I will sit down and join the panel, and I will ask, starting from my right, Major General McCurry to begin with his opening statement.
How about now? There you go. All right. Trainable. Hey, thanks, Ms. Hawkins, for the introduction and facilitating the discussion today on training. It's an honor to sit on a panel like this with old mentors and a lot of friends and talk about, from my perspective, as the aviation branch chief, doing institutional training, but also the one responsible for writing the aviation training strategy that the operational force tries to implement out there in our cabs. How we're trying to drive that change and how we're generating highly trained, disciplined, and fit aviation soldiers and developing combined arms maneuver experts and leaders of character. We in the aviation force gained a great deal of flight experience over the last 20 years. But when you look at the macro level at the branch, what we have seen is a loss of a lot of that experience through retirement. And now in our junior and mid-grade warrant officer and commissioned officer pilot ranks, a steep decline in the number of flight hours that the average aviator out there in the formation has. So that's the first thing, is just the change over time in experience levels. Then the other part that influences that is the fact that we are asking them to train collectively on tasks that we may or may not have conducted at the scale that we have. And we're asking them to train in environments that are more realistic to the threat, which drives us into lower flight profiles and then do that in austere conditions. So there's some increasing risk there. I would tell you it's not isolated just to our aviators. We have an experience gap in our maintainers in Army aviation as well. Some of that due to the force management levels that we implemented as we started trying to draw down and come out of Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we'll talk a little bit today about how we're getting out of some of that and then some solutions. And one of the things I'm really focused on as the branch chief is the reiteration of what we expect of Army aviators, this upholding of the sacred trust to the soldier on the ground, and that we expect them to be there when needed and to manage the risks associated with getting there and being at the right place at the right time on the battlefield. So we're doing that through a reiteration of this aviation warfighting culture and getting after it with the force that way. I'll stop there and turn it over to Hank Taylor.
All right, I kind of, said a lot here just before we go into the panel. Specifically at, at headquarters DA, training is something my boss, the G3, Lieutenant General Matlock, former Demo TR, he is a trainer, right? I worked for him in Afghanistan when he was a division commander. Training has always been important in the United States Army. It's something that we do extremely well. I think I was just talking to one of you in the hallway about what we do in the Army, and it's amazing when we take people off the street and in our what we do, put them in the front or the back of an aircraft or onto the flight line or into a TOC, and something they've never known about. And it's amazing when you go to a combat training center and watch an aviation battalion operate, and you have to ask sometimes, how did we get there? And we do that through extremely well thought out, well organized, designed after an aviation training strategy that General McCurry owns, and then ensuring that for me, from headquarters DA, it's resource to do. And so that's probably, for me, the number one thing that we can talk about here on the panel is, as we look at how we resource training and how we prioritize, because not everybody gets to go to a CTC, how do we get to, and this is one of the things that G3 talks about for everybody, not everybody's going to a CTC, a combat training center, but we do expect everybody to have a high level of collective training in MDO. And so how do we do that? And I would tell you the way we're doing that is, in our lane, is ensuring the flight hour program is fully funded, ensuring that our aviation simulation simulators and training aids are available. That's probably one thing as I look at the future, and in this group as we look at industry, it's critical. Critical that, as we look at how important simulation, whether it's embedded trainers that we've talked about or standalone trainers, it's critical to ensure our aviation force is trained. So Dave, over to you.
Good morning. Definitely happy to be here joining the entire aviation team. I'll tell you, I've really been fortunate within the Army National Guard to work with this group of fine folks. We comprise just under 50% of the aviation community resides within the National Guard and also within the reserves. And I'll tell you, we've got elements of the Army National Guard represented throughout the entire enterprise with each of the six-pack members, ensuring that our equities are accounted for as ideas and plans and concepts are getting developed. And that's been super critical for us as a National Guard. Across the board, we remain active, no different than we have for the past several decades, conducting operations within the CENTCOM AOR, definitely on the southwest border. And what we've learned over the years is training for our federal mission ultimately helps support our state missions and our domestic requirements. But without a doubt, there are some unique nuances as we support in the domestic environment, especially when you start looking at avionics and mission command type systems for communication, and requirements that are needed in order to support the states during domestic emergencies. Probably the most critical thing that has changed within the National Guard of recent years was when the chief of the National Guard Bureau directed division alignment, initially for training, but really this division alignment has grown much larger than just training. The whole concept is to ultimately have divisions that have similar capabilities and platforms and systems that can support the warfighter on the ground. And I think it's really done a lot for us, changing that mindset, because it's recaged the aviation community's mind in terms of what are the capabilities and gaps that are missing, and what do we as a group need to change internal to our own organizations to make sure that we have the appropriate focus for the division commanders and the needs of the infantry brigade commanders. And I'll pause there and hand it off to General Quinlan, who I also have a minor connection with. He was a brigade commander, my first brigade commander when I was a lieutenant, so a little bit more remote. So all three of us have a connection up here.
All right, I'll take credit for all of you, I guess. It really means I'm older than dirt, but that's okay. Many thanks, General Brown, to AUSA for this function. I'm glad to be back here in participating in this exercise today. And to our industry partners, you're so much an important part of this whole operations. Thanks to all of you for that. And to my colleagues, you can see that we've got some connections here from the past. And by the way, you know, I had other people in the audience in 10th Aviation when I was there, and Bill Morris and A.T. Ball were the architects of our, what did we spend, 2 months down on the border long ago, JTF 6 mission. And for us, it was training. For the Customs and Border Patrol, it was a godsend because we brought sensors for the wall. We had an infantry tow platoon with their night sights, and we had Kiowa warriors flying at night with bone phones talking right to the Customs and Border Patrol. And we just shut down 100 miles of the border at a time for what, about 2 weeks? And then we'd move to another 100-mile sector and then to another 100-mile sector. Meanwhile, we had a Kiowa warrior staff doing gunnery at, and they would finish. One company, one troop would finish, and then they would rotate. And we just kept rotating the aviation around so that one is in the planning phase and the development, one's in the execution, and one's doing gunnery. And I got 900 hours of flying time paid for by JTF 6 mission. And of course, my CG at the time, very capable, brilliant general officer, you know, he wasn't convinced that it was a good idea to go down there. We had great training. I think you even were up on the ABC of the Air Force command and control aircraft. Just a great exercise. Those are the sort of things that I think need to continue to go on. Now, I don't suggest we need to deploy any more down on the border. I think the Guards got that mission, and God help you, we didn't have an invasion like we have right now. Okay, I think you know, I think if I bet you George Washington, as he was stepping into his watercraft, as he was getting ready to cross the Delaware River choked with ice, under his breath, I'm sure he was saying, "Damn this climate change! It's just killing us." And that's all you're going to hear about climate change from me today. So I'm really glad to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the entire panel for those introductory statements. So we're going to open up to the floor for questions. You can either, Alex will come by with a mic, or you can write down your questions and they'll bring them up here, and I will try to interpret your handwriting. Any questions for now? Are they coming up? All right.
Hey, sir, I'm going to address General McCurry, the branch chief down there. Hey, sir, I know you're struggling and you're doing well with looking at how you're going to train our aviators going for large-scale conflict and operating in dispersed environments. And you talked about maintenance. I want to give kudos out to the AMCOM commander back over here. But looking at how you're going to have to change that training for the aviation maintainers when you're operating in the condition you and General Taylor was talking about, and dispersed, where you're going to be at platoon section areas. You're not going to have the hub spoke, and have those large contingents of how you're going to go about training from just the specifics of individual tasks. What you're doing now with the job book is going there, but potentially going to an AMP, more of a generalist capability, how to retask organize. As you say, you guys are looking at the force design for aircraft, but do you bust up the AVM capabilities, put them down in the line troops. So they're going to be able to operate in those distant areas. And what do you see those critical skills that your maintainers are going to have? And a lot of times we think about the pilots and training, maintenance is last of the time period to be able to maintain that op tempo that you're going to have in the future.
Yeah, thanks, JR. I was going to bring you back on to figure that out. But the, JR commanded 128 down there at Fort Eustis, maybe before it was 128 though, but training our young maintainers. So I would say a couple things. First of all, it's got to be holistic. We got to look all the way across .mil PFP at this. So I talked structure a little bit earlier on. The same soldiers are in the AVUM units that are in the AVM units or the aircraft support companies. The difference is the special tools and the authorities. So, I think we will look together with AMCOM and with us as holding the pen on how we think we need to design structure before we push it into the building on where's the right balance for that and how is that structured? Is it better to have more maintainers with the small flight companies in these dispersed locations? Is it better to have more teams? So that's kind of the structure piece. The special tools piece is especially concerning to me. How you have to go about procuring those. I mean, we all know in cabs that there's one pitot test set and you're trying to get it to the one austere place where there's an aircraft that needs it to get it back up. So things like that. I think this consolidation of MOS thing we are in the infancy of. I don't know that we've coalesced there yet. We still got to work that a bit. I've got the concepts experimentation directorate down at Fort Rucker working on what this dispersed posture looks like, and then doing the kind of waterfall analysis on personnel, tools, and things. To get back to the training, the task training, I mentioned a little bit this experience gap of our maintainers and our non-commissioned officers out there. So just like you can't grow an infantry squad leader overnight, you can't take a private and make them an infantry squad leader. Those staff sergeants in Army Aviation are those technical inspectors that are making sure our maintenance is right and keeping us safe, and we can't grow them overnight. Unfortunately, some of our mid-grade NCOs right now, we robbed them of some sets and reps when we didn't deploy maintenance with units during the force management levels as we drew down in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so this aviation maintainer training program that we've got now, and for everybody in the audience, just think the aircrew training folder that aviators have where they're checked off on certain tasks over time and certain iterations. We are doing that now with maintainers. And we're attempting right now to institutionalize it. So as they come out of Fort Eustis, they have this, and we're working with all of the cabs to implement it. And then Brigadier General Chuck Lombardo and Dame OTR is working hard with us to be able to do an automation pilot. So we're not putting more work out there on the force. We're actually trying to train. We're giving them a tool to handle the more work. And so that's kind of how we're looking at the task training and iterations. I don't know if anybody else on the panel has more to add.
Mac, I'll just say one thing. One thing I've been impressed with is coming to this job, and we go to some of the industry days and AUSA and Quad A, and we go around to see a lot of your booths and things in industry. I think as we look forward, to FEL specifically, I've heard a lot of people talk about how maintenance is going to be done on those aircraft, and I think that's a critical piece that I've heard General McCurry's team talk about. Is obviously, I've watched the branch already trying to figure out how to do it with the fleet we have now, right? And how that's going to do. But then I think what's going to be key and critical as we, look at the future vertical lift aircraft is, all right, how is maintenance going to be different? And I know, at the PM and the PO level, we're talking about that and, making how maintenance is done on future aircraft. If it's the same way we're doing it now, then we got something wrong. That's just my personal opinion, right? Is, as we look at that, part of that I know Design Mac works on is, all right, what is it going to take to maintain an FEL at these austere locations? My guess is, it's going to be simpler, not, and that's the hard part, but we have a more technically advanced aircraft, but it's going to be more advanced to maintain. Well, that's kind of counterintuitive, right? And I know, and I think that's an important thing as we look, to the future and special tools and, how many tools we actually need for an aircraft so that things are more common.
I think there's perhaps even some lessons learned, honestly, that the Guard and Reserves could provide in that arena. When you think about the National Guard writ large, a lot of our units are dispersed down to the platoon level. So over the years, we've had to build, additional capacity in some of our full-time maintainers, get them the special tools and expertise to perform functions that, might not normally reside in a particular unit. We're definitely concerned as well, as we're searching what the role of even our TASMGs are for those that aren't familiar with it. Theater Aviation Sustainment Maintenance Group, a unique piece of force structure in the Guard, works hand in hand with AMCOM, has some capabilities. Is it structured appropriately? Does it have the right equipment, tools? And we're trying to resolve some of those issues as well.
My 2 cents worth is that, and to your point, Hank, more complicated aircraft, more technically capable, but with MOSA coming on board, which will take a while, but also with the fact that we need to pay attention to how we design the aircraft for ease of maintenance and how do we eliminate maintenance in our design. And I think industry can figure that out for us, and I think they're already doing that. So I think the idea is how do we also do better at troubleshooting for these soldiers and maintainers? Because how much time do you spend trying to figure out what's wrong with the aircraft and you don't know? And if you don't know, then you're spinning your wheels. So, and to reduce the risk at the same time. So all these things I think industry can deliver. We just need to make that a requirement. And I'm sensing that already is in play, but we'll see. But that shouldn't be more maintenance intensive because multi-domain operations tells us we've got to be able to operate in a predictive and prognostic way for a given amount of time. And we know we over-maintain our aircraft today. So let's stop doing that. And I think we can tackle that one. It's going to take a while, but we'll get there.
Thank you. So this question is for all members of the panel who want to reply. We understand the need to train for MDO. What lessons from training aviators and operations in Iraq and Afghanistan still apply in MDO? How do we ensure that they are not forgotten, like what happened in Vietnam, where many lessons were forgotten and had to be relearned the hard way in combat?
Yeah, great question out there. Thanks for asking that. So what we don't want to do and what the impression we hope we didn't give here is that we'll ignore the last 20 years and go back to 1999 and do what we were doing then. I can remember, I went to flight school in 1989, as General Ostovich pointed out earlier. And all of the flight instructors at that point were Vietnam veterans, right? And there were certain maneuvers that were not in the POI. And generally, when you finished the structured POI, there would be a day or two where you were waiting to go to the next phase, and those veterans would demonstrate what the aircraft was capable of doing with some of these maneuvers, to you. And miraculously, when we got into the fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, some of those maneuvers became what we know now as combat maneuvering flight, that are tasks, and we are retaining those tasks to help us do that. So I want to first say we didn't mean to give the impression that we're throwing out the last 20 years. Also, there's great valuable leadership lessons and small unit leadership and what it means to integrate at the lowest level that we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan that we want to retain. So a lot of those we have folded into some of the changes to PME at Fort Rucker. But I think, I remember what I don't want to happen is I remember being a squadron XO in 2004 when the insurgency was blossoming in Iraq. And I was in a heavy divisional cavalry squadron. And I remember we were so comfortable with combined arms maneuver and integration of fires. I can remember being there and being frustrated and saying, why won't they just stand and fight us? If they'll stand and fight us, we could maneuver and fire and employ fires, you know. And then fast forward to today, and we go out to collective training events, and you know, our teams can say, you know, we can stay in the air 24/7 by managing our aircraft and crews, but you know, this combined arms maneuver and employment of fires thing is hard. We have to, you know, we've done this before. We can do this again in the Army. This is just us with agile, adaptive, you know, learning organizations and leaders getting after it.
And I think one of the things that keeps us grounded, so I'll give two answers, is one, as you look at our mission essential tasks, right? And for our commander's task list, you know, for our aviators and our maintainers, those things are going to continue to drive, you know. And so as General McCurry's team, you know, gives that to us, you know, and ensures our doctrine is there, I think that's the thing that grounds us. But, you know, when I look at, you know, and Mac, when we were flying, you know, the beginning of OEF and OIF, and then, you know, leaving OEF myself and those 5 times in between, I flew differently every single deployment in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so, you know, to say that, you know, you're right. What in that question, some of the things I'd even ask ourselves, you know, deployment 1, I did X, deployment 2, I did X and Y. And then I realized in deployment 3, I was back to some of the things I did based on the threat. And so I think the strength of Army aviation and the Army of how we, one, continually revise doctrine, right? That's key. But 2, we actually test ourselves on it. And I think that's the strength of what we do, is at the CTCs and at home station training, we actually grade ourselves really hard on these things. And so I think that's a way to do that. But I think the one thing that you can never get away with and say is, until you're in combat, you don't know if you're doing it right, right? And we would all of us here would say we're probably at 0% of predicting, you know, what it is. But what we do really, really well at is we train so hard and we are rigorous at it, and we are flexible enough in our doctrine that we can change quickly. So that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I don't know that I've got a lot more to add, except the thought that we did in many cases operate in a relatively dispersed environment. Now, what I think is different is it was very static for the most part, not a dynamic environment. And so what we're going to have to think through is how do we, you know, leverage the TTPs that we learned in the past and apply them, you know, to the future so that we can operate in that dispersed environment more rapidly. I think the C2 capabilities that are getting developed, you know, with the network CFT are dramatically different as well, which will have the potential to enable us to, you know, conduct that type of command and control a lot easier and a lot quicker as you start, you know, bringing that synthesis of information up to the higher level.
We need to remember that, you know, our doctrine is not dogma, and I think we're pretty good at that. You know, sometimes it's tactics, techniques, and procedures, and you apply it to the situation. And I love going to JRTC and NTC, and I had a second rotation to JRT, thank God, when I was in the 82nd, and finishing up with Kaya Warrior at Fort Hood. And we were going to do the 1 week, you know, I'll call it rinky dink, not because of the Aviation Training Brigade, but because of the limited resources they had. We couldn't even use our secure SINGAR radios because they didn't have them. So we were matched up perfectly with General Abizaid, well, at the time, Colonel Abizaid's rotation out of the 82nd. And so I went to division commander, said, sir, you're already down one aviation organization. Send me there instead of staying here at Fort Hood. Well, I immediately became persona non grata at Fort Hood, but we did that. We deployed. I went back, got the order. We deployed right from JRTC from Fort Hood right into JRTC. the great thing about them is their resource for that. And they're always trying to teach you the doctrinal stuff, which is fine. But General Abizaid was and is a very unorthodox individual when situations call for it. And we had just a great rotation. And you know, it was free play, and we took advantage of free play. And so I think our training and our innovative nature, because we're Americans, and when we leave the birth canal, we come out and all possibilities are staring us in the face. So that's the advantage we got to continue to take with this. That's our strength, and our training is so much important to bring that together.
You know, it's funny. Just to add to that is, it's funny how 30 years later I found out the real story of how we went from Fort Hood to JRTC now. You know, so but I think that's a great example of what we have that very few do. Is, you know, and that's something that's really important in the Army. Is if you talk to, you know, Dame OTR, the amount of money that we put into training, the TT peg, you know, and you look at that. It's so important, and I think that's how we do that. Is staying and giving everybody. And the problem is how do you get those opportunities as much as you can? Because, like I said earlier, not everybody gets a CTC. It is the you know, the gold standard and all that. But what we can do, the best we can, is do the home station training of that.
Thank you. For this question, I'm going to start with Brigadier David Hall, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the panel. So could you please discuss allied and/or partner training with the U.S. Army Aviation? And the reason why, David, I want to start with you is because I know we have the state partnership programs, right? But there might be more as well to discuss.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. For those that aren't familiar with the state partnership program, a lot of our states have partnerships with various countries around the world. My experience, you know, in California, it was the Ukraine and Nigeria. And what's been interesting is as that program has evolved over, you know, the past 20 to 30 years, they're expanding into areas like aviation, where they previously had not necessarily been as interested in, because they were focused on other, other areas, you know, on the ground, that sort of thing. The National Guard is sort of unique in that a lot of the nations that are out there are really looking for something that is more of a homeland defense capable force, a little bit cheaper to manage, operate, reliant on civilian soldiers and citizen soldiers that come when the need is called. So that partnership has been great. I still think that there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. Ultimately, all of those partnership arrangements are, you know, coordinated and synchronized, you know, through the COCOMs, you know, based upon the requirements that they have and the goals of the countries.
Yeah, I'll talk about it from the institutional perspective a little bit. So, you know, we always go in coalitions, and you know, the key to coalition is when you have a coalition partner, you take advantage of what they do well. And so we have partners at Fort Rucker. We have allied nations that fly Apaches, and we have some of their instructors teaching our students at Fort Rucker. And it doesn't matter whether it's a British student, an American student, any other student that flies Apaches. They're right there in the institutional force training the POI. So that's the first thing. We have other nations that have different capabilities, different aircraft, and they contribute that way. Those relationships bear fruit when you start to go somewhere else, and all of a sudden it's a familiar face you're talking to out there on the battlefield. And I think that as we continue to evolve this, we've seen partner nations come back for additional training. So, you know, we have Iraqi officers that train in our Air Mission Commander course at Fort Rucker right now, and then go back and help to build their capacity in their nation. So we can start it in the institutional level, build relationships that matter later on.
Thank you. So the next question It says here for Major General McCurry or Brigadier General Hall, but I think we should open it up to the whole panel. How do you envision mission simulation and modernization for training evolving with the increased capability that may not be able to be trained at home station? And I would actually add on to that from the simulation perspective, perhaps training that you don't want the adversary to see as well.
Yeah, so I see a lot of it. We're working right now, so we kind of classify our trainers two different ways. Systems trainers that are focused on the platforms themselves, non-systems trainers, like our AVCAT system where we do collective training. So I think one of the great things is I remember General Taylor and I shared a CAV squadron across the Pacific when we were CAV commanders. We had rotational cavalry squadron to Korea, and our cavalry squadron from 10th Cab went and was with Hank for 9 months. And the great thing before we went is we had the terrain, right? So all those orientation flights that many of you might remember going up in Korea to making sure you don't cross the wrong line. We did all that with our leaders in the AVCAT at Fort Drum on the Korean terrain before we sent the squadron over there. So just a small example of how you can leverage some of that. If we look at what STE is doing in the synthetic training environment, one of the great things is the one world terrain, and that's been used right now today. Before we actually have everything fully fielded in all of the simulation, we've used that piece of kit to look at some real world terrain and do missions. And so I think those are key examples of how we can do that. For the systems trainers, the real struggle and what I would ask industry to stay with us on is concurrency. Every time we update the version of an AH-64, we need the LCT to be updated concurrently across the force, not 7 years later finishing the rest of the force. Okay, realizing that that's General Taylor's to get resourced for you, but so we need that on the systems trainers, and then on the other ones, I think for me, as I envision, it's not just about Army aviation. I talked about MCO and General Buzzard, and us being able to tie collective trainers together across warfighting functions. I think on a LISCO battlefield, to your final point about being able to train and rehearse things we don't want the whole world to see, is also critical. Over.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, simulations are obviously a vital, component to all of our training programs. And, for the National Guard specifically, a lot of that ends up becoming the tyranny of distance for us. And so I think the idea that General McCurry had mentioned about connectivity of various systems becomes a huge enabler for us within the National Guard. And I'll give an example, from California. The division, has an infantry brigade that is in Puerto Rico, an infantry brigade that is inside of California, an aviation brigade that's, several hours away from the headquarters. And so the ability to, connect these systems in the future so that they're interoperable, and you have this ability to conduct live and constructive training, I think at the same time would be tremendously beneficial for the Guard.
Thank you. I was just reading it, got a good one here for Major General McCurry. Sir, would you please talk about your current and future training vision for integrity with Air Force and Navy close air support and strike fighters?
Yeah, let me just talk about. So first of all, I think I start out talking about history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So Lieutenant Colonel Cody, kind of kicking the door down and opening the doorway for the joint force. There's some precedent there that Army aviation can have a role in this pre-phase 3 Bravo part of an operation, setting conditions and helping enable the rest of the joint force. And I think it's pretty easy to see how you could do some of those things in Indo-PACOM as well, being dispersed and on, in different locations. I think, we have not done a ton of training like that right now. But one of the things we are doing is, if you look at the joint services right now, Army Aviation is the only flying service that does not have a tactics course. So one of the things we're doing is I just sent a group of CW5s from Fort Rucker through the Marine Corps Air Weapons Training School, MOTS, and we sent them out there. And they took AH-64s, and we were partnered with the Utah Guard doing that with their aircraft. And we sent them through the course. The reason we did that was not to just get them the cool MOTS patch and be patch wearers, but they're developing the POI for the future Army Aviation Tactics Instructor course, so that we can then, one of the strategies that we're working right now, I talked about this experience gap and having to train collective tasks. Well, if you look at our ages, unless you're our age, you probably haven't trained collective maneuver with a moving ground force on a piece of terrain larger than a platoon. And so how do you help lieutenants and captains be able to do that when your warrant officers haven't done it either? So we're taking instructor pilots, we're expanding the use of our unit trainer program inside troops and companies, letting those other unit trainers that commanders designate do some of the tasks that were previously reserved for instructor pilots, so that we can free instructor pilots up to help with the collective training aspect and the collective employment of weapon systems. To do that, though, I then have to train them to do that, and that's what we're going to do with the Aviation Tactics Instructor course. So long way around answering the question that we're using what the joint services are doing to enable what we need to do in the future.
Does anyone else on the panel want to add? No? Okay. So this one is for Brigadier General Hall. Do you believe the active duty and or National Guard's domestic support roles following an emergency are evolving? If so, what are the implications to our force structure, aviation or otherwise?
Absolutely. I think domestic ops are evolving, and the nature of the emergencies are growing, and I think the demand from the governors and really the capability of the Guard to respond to those domestic emergencies is expanding. And, when you think about, Katrina and the amount of resources that were brought to bear, in that environment, or recently with the wildland firefighting in California, what started out as a great interagency helicopter program expanded into unmanned aerial systems, expanded into, and that was provided by the Air Guard, expanded into military police, expanded into decon. And the National Guard was able to respond again because of those federal capabilities that get developed. I think there are some nuances that are, niche. Air-ground communication, being one, primarily a, National Guard requirement, but obviously when activated, Title 10 forces working with, the states would also have to have that same type of air-to-ground communication, especially as these emergencies grow. The other capabilities within aviation that we're always interested in, our hoist capability, as well as our FLIR technology to search for, personnel. But even simple things such as, LRAD speakers, we've been, looking at whether or not we need to procure something similar to that because of this gap in communication that we sometimes have. And sometimes when you're in a helicopter, you just have to be able to physically talk to somebody on the ground. But I think the majority of the platforms itself, those issues they're solid, right? The airframes are producing the capabilities we need. And we're really excited about this idea of MOSA and thinking about National Guard capabilities early on in the development process so that if we do have a need, we can quickly, patch that capability on and operate rather than, tear apart an aircraft only to build something that's very, very niche. So very, I think important, as we continue to move forward, having our personnel, at Futures Command and involved with the PMs so that we think about that stuff and we save taxpayers dollars.
Thank you. So this question is for Major General McCurry, but we'll open it up also for other opinions on the panel. What changes are necessary for training at the combat training centers and home station as we field future vertical lift to the force?
Yeah, so I think General Taylor did a good job of teeing this one up in his discussion. So first of all, some of the things we're doing with the CTCs right now, as we talk about division as the decisive element, is how do you engage division command and control and enable them to do some things with DAVARTI assets and aviation assets at a CTC without disrupting, that valuable training that we give to every BCT commander and staff to maneuver their forces. And so working with General Taylor, Kurt Taylor out at NTC, we're looking at opportunities to bring division command posts, DTACs out there on the front side, maneuver some forces. There's other training areas that are near to NTC that we could utilize across the joint force to have greater stimulation of our systems during that part of the exercise. And you could almost envision that being structured like a campaign where, the division begins to shape before that BCT gets in the fight. And then the BCT goes in the box and they're in their sector. And now you have the other parts of the division operating in support of that BCT, but also you keep that notional 52nd division kind of metering the availability of assets so we don't paint a wrong picture for the BCT where they have access to all the assets all the time. So that's the first thing. I think that our focus on organic mission sets, General Taylor mentioned, we're working with ForceCom Commander right now to be able to send more organically designed elements into the CTCs. So assault battalions to JRTC, attack battalions to NTC, so they can do some of those organic collective mission tasks instead of being restricted just to the multifunctional tasks at the company level. And then this electronic warfare thing is a big piece, beginning to see ourselves in terms of acoustic signature, noise and light discipline, thermal discipline, and electronic warfare discipline is critical to how we move forward at the CTCs. And both of them are critically, all three of them are critically engaged on that. And then before we go, I think the biggest thing we have to do well is we used to drive home doctrine and enemy order of battle, and every scout pilot that went to NTC knew that, the counter recon fight, if you didn't win the counter recon fight, you weren't going to win. And if you did win it, you had a small chance of winning, but we knew, hey, when you see 2 BRDMs, that's flash traffic, that's the CRP, and we're looking for 3 BMPs this far behind them. That's the forward security element. And we have to inculcate that kind of knowledge of our potential adversaries and blend that with our doctrine, I think, in our prep.
And Mac, one thing I'll just add there, and I think Dave, I just talked to all the National Guard attack battalion commanders yesterday, right? And one of the things that we see a gap is, it's going to be very difficult for a full battalion from the Guard to get to a CTC. But one of the things that we're trying to do is we talk about the total Army and do that is in these near years is how do we get companies to plug into those cabs? They're going with the eventual set is how do I get a battalion that is from a division from a National Guard? Because if you look at how the National Guard operated, great teammates the last 20 years, deploy companies, but there's going to be a time where we're going to expect these, just to talk, these 5 attack battalions to operate as an attack battalion. So that's an additional piece of how we see the CTCs continuing to be able to increase readiness for the total force.
Just to add a little bit. The National Guard has without a doubt been focused on this MDO issue as well, and is developing partnerships within their states across all of the branches that they might have, as well as the joint teammates. And they're creating some unique joint interagency sort of capabilities out there. And I think that what it's going to allow us to do as a Guard is develop a little bit more rapid than we might otherwise. We've got essentially, 2 to 3 CTCs, per year that we support. Everybody else, for the most part, is, conducting warfighter or localized training. Everybody, flows through the rearm process, essentially different gates, start out at platoon, grow to larger levels. These small little niche opportunities that are floating out in the specific states where, a Marine unit needs a capability, or a Air Force needs a capability, to support some sort of exercise, is something that we're going to be able to leverage in order to grow the capacity and the capabilities of our National Guard forces writ large.
There are some opportunities. I reflect back in 1985, I was a full-time manner at Rhode Island National Guard. So for 3 years, I did 3 annual training periods. The third one, we had an opportunity, the 82nd Airborne was having an exercise, and they needed an aviation force. So we signed up for it, took the whole AirCAV squadron, and deployed by ground and air to Fort Bragg. And then we were the OP4 Air. And this is back in the day when the active unit was just bringing on Black Hawks. And I had all these Vietnam era, thousands of hours aviators and 086s and Hueys, and they were incredible. So that was an opportunity. So I don't know if those opportunities are still out there, but it can be done. And that was a great exercise for all involved.
Thank you. So we're down to 3 minutes. So we're gonna run the gauntlet here on one question going down the panel, and we're gonna start with Major General Quinlan, retired here, for your advice to this question for the 3 gentlemen here, and then each of these gentlemen can then give their answer for their perspective and their role today. And that is, if someone came up to you, you had the elevator speech of 15 to 20 seconds, what are your priorities in your role today?
As an Army aviator and looking at the brigade level, I would say, if, from a training perspective, number one, I told everybody, fly your flying hours, okay? And if you to do that, you got to have a good maintenance operation. So shield your brigade with division policies. You got to talk to your division commander, make sure he understands that in order to achieve what he asked you to do, those guys need to do their job every day. And luckily at Fort Drum, we were across the light line. So I said, we're deployed all the time. The hangar is in the training area, so we're in the field all the time. And that worked out pretty good. But you got to fly those flying hours, because that's also the maintenance that provides the training for the maintainers. And I'll stop right there.
Yeah, for myself, without a doubt, I think my number one focus is on people, and the reason why is, sort of as was alluded to earlier in the active component, is we're in a war on talent, right? And that's the same within the National Guard, and I think with the talented people, you have the ability to accomplish everything, right? And we're at a stage where I think we have to rethink, whether or not we've got the right policies and the right, compensation packages, et cetera, that are competitive, with industry in order to ensure we sustain that talent. That talent, that we're bringing in today as lieutenants, they're going to be the brigade commanders of 2040. And I think it's important that we spend a lot of time focusing on them, what their requirements are, and ensure that they're kept in the program.
We've talked a lot about the future. We talk a lot about Army 2030 and 2040. Where I sit, that's very important. We continue to focus and make sure we're resourced and we have good plans to take us there. But as I said earlier, with all that, we still are fighting today, right, and training for today. So I think with so much focus on the future, it's a balance for all of us to ensure that we keep, our eyes on both lines of effort that go forward. But for me, as the operations officers, I look at that as ensuring that the modernization way forward does not detract from our capability to provide combat-ready forces to the joint force today. And so as we look at that in training, and this is something we battle in the building all the time, is money for modernization, money for training, money for ops, and those things. It's a balance, right? It's a pretty big fight to ensure that we have what we need today that allows us to win today, and then be able to win in the future. Mac.
My priorities as the branch chief kind of mirror Army priorities: people, readiness, modernization. So first on the people, I talked about aviation warfighter culture. And I need our young aviators and aviation force out there to understand why we exist and what we expect of them for the ground force. Number one. Second, when we talk about readiness, I'm focused on the collective readiness and enabling aviation as maneuver as a part of the division decisive unit of action. And I work closely with Warfighter and Fort Leavenworth to do that, how we're getting after that. And then lastly, to put the best equipment we can put in the soldiers' hands, just as Mr. Bush closed with earlier today. Those would be my top three. Last thing before we get off the stage, I would say we are in a war for talent. We have Army Aviation is not seeing a problem filling our positions right now. We still have about 4 applicants for every flight seat, and we're filling our enlisted soldiers right now. But we need help for our Army. 23% of high school seniors can meet the requirements to enter the force, and only 9% show the propensity to serve. We need all of you to help us connect out there and get those numbers up. Thank you.
I want to thank this panel for sharing all of your experience and wisdom with us. So let's give a hand to our panel. Thank you.
Okay, folks, what a great start. Let's give all of our speakers for this morning another round of applause for their time and expertise today.